Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests here in-house, we would ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will post today's program on our Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Leading our discussion is Emily Gao. Ms. Gao is director of our Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. She is an attorney who has defended religious freedom for the last 14 years. She has worked on behalf of victims of religious freedom violations in East Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and South Asia, at the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom and Beckett Law. Previously, she worked at the United Nations and also at the law firm of Latham and Watkins. She taught international human rights law at George Mason University's Law School as an adjunct professor. Please join me in welcoming Emily Gao. Emily?
Thank you, John. Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Today's topic, radicalization of children. These are three words that should never go together. But in our modern age of terror, we see that groups like Boko Haram, ISIS, and the Taliban are increasingly using children as young as 4 years old to launch attacks in Syria and Iraq, Nigeria and Indonesia, as well as in Austria, France, and Germany. Worldwide, these terror groups have abducted, recruited, co-opted, and in some cases persuaded parents to enlist their children in terrorism. In some cases, terrorists have forced children to commit acts of terror under threat of torture and rape. In Nigeria, Boko Haram kidnapped women and girls, and now they make up the majority of their suicide bombers. 1 in 5 of these suicide bombers is a child. How should our societies, governments, and the international community treat children who have been radicalized and have committed acts of terror? Today's panelists will look at 3 dimensions of this growing trend. First, from a counterterrorism perspective, how should governments address the security threat that these children pose, not only to peace and security and human rights in foreign countries, but also in the homeland? How should the law treat them? As criminals or as victims, or both? Second, what are the best approaches to de-radicalizing children and giving them a way back into society? Are governments and the international community coordinating the right actors? Are their strategies yielding positive results? Or could they even be increasing support for terror? Are experts, including theological perspectives, along with psychological and medical treatments for these children, as they are often told that it is a religious duty for them to commit acts of terror? Third, what is the best way to create the conditions in civil society and education for these children and youth to avoid being ensnared by the efforts of terror groups to recruit and radicalize them? These children should have been like their peers, going to school, playing games, playing sports, and being nurtured and cared for by their families. But instead, these terror groups have instrumentalized them, and in some cases, their parents have cooperated. Today's panelists will examine these questions revolving around criminal responsibility, de-radicalization and reintegration, and prevention. Robin Simcox is the Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He specializes in counterterrorism and national security policy. Robin has testified before Congress on multiple occasions on issues related to ISIS, al-Qaeda, and associated movements. He has provided evidence to the British Parliament on intelligence policy. His commentary appears widely in newspapers, and he regularly appears on a variety of broadcast and cable news outlets. Robin was a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society in London, a foreign policy think tank. There he offered several important works, including Al-Qaeda in the United States, a 728-page monograph profiling every court conviction in America linked to Al-Qaeda. Robin received a Master of Science degree in U.S. Foreign Policy from the Institute for the Study of the Americas, University of London, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in International History from the University of Leeds. Jessica Trisco-Darden is an assistant professor at American University's School of International Service and associate director of Bridging the Gap. She is an inaugural Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Her research focuses on international influences on interstate conflict and political violence, particularly within Asia. Dr. Trisco-Darden is also the lead investigator for the Women in Combat Roles project that examines female participation in national militaries. She has published peer-reviewed articles on alliance dynamics, political violence, and human security. Her commentary is also widely disseminated through print and broadcast media. And Tina Ramirez is the president and the founder of Hardwired, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing religious freedom in law and policy worldwide. She is currently on the board of the Richmond-based First Freedom Center. She previously worked as International and Government Relations Director at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty and is a foreign policy advisor and expert on international religious freedom for a variety of members of Congress. There, she helped found and direct the Congressional International Religious Freedom Caucus, where she drafted several pieces of legislation to protect religious freedom around the world. She was also a contributing author and editor of Human Rights in the United States, a dictionary and documents. Would you please join me in welcoming our speakers?
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to spend a bit of time focusing on how Europe has framed and is responding to the issue of young people becoming attracted to Islamist ideology. For some years now, European governments have paid particular attention to foreign fighters returning to their countries of origin, particularly as ISIS is squeezed in Syria and Iraq, loses territory, and people begin to flee. What to do with the children that accompany the returnees, though, has received much less focus, not just from government, although perhaps that's beginning to change, but also, I think, from the think tank and the academic community more broadly. If you try and assess the numbers, the precise number of children who could be arriving into Europe from what was formerly ISIS's territory is unclear for a variety of reasons. Proving nationality is not going to be straightforward. Identification papers could be lost or only have ever been issued by ISIS, and so understandably not recognized by other European countries. Proving paternity of some of these children is not going to be easy in some cases, especially the children of those women who've been raped by ISIS fighters. Despite some of those complexities, some European governments are at least somewhat cognizant of the scale of the problem, though. So the precise numbers are unclear, but it's certainly a case of mid to high hundreds of children that we're potentially dealing with here, rather than kind of like the low dozens. So in France, for example, there's around 460 children who were in ISIS-controlled territory. Around a third of those were born in Syria or Iraq. At the end of 2016, the Dutch were aware of around 80 children with some kind of connection. And there's also believed to be American and British children still in the Syria-Iraq theater.